Hey everybody, welcome to your Monday teachings. This week we're going to look at the general epistles. So we're going to look at a collection of books. We're going to go through them pretty quick. These would include James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, the book of Revelation, and Hebrews. We will not look at Hebrews this week or Revelation this week, but we'll look at those in the next following week. So let's start with James. James was one of the first letters essentially written. It debuts right around about 50 AD, so it goes right alongside some of Paul's earliest writings, and even going back to the time when Mark wrote his gospel. So we've got a really early picture essentially from James, who did travel with Jesus, and it's a short letter, but it is important. It's one of those unique ones too. Luther was not a big fan of it, mostly because James is very heavy in the law. In fact, one of the themes under the law is that the whole law must be kept or death would follow. Works are required for salvation, and sinners are judged by the law as transgressors, and faith apart from works is dead. So this seems like it goes against the Pauline teachings, where we are justified outside of our faith. But if we read James in just a little bit different light, we actually read it essentially backwards. We would see James isn't saying that your works are required for salvation, but that they are a result of it. So you're saved first, and then the good works come. That's essentially how James constructs his arguments. There is gospel themes in here. We have the good and perfect gifts of the Father of lights. He brought forth by the word of truth, heirs of the kingdom. Those are counted righteous. The coming of the Lord, compassion and mercy, forgiveness, because of the death of Christ and the resurrection. Sinners are judged under the law of liberty. And so that falls in line with what Paul and Peter and John all talk about. Matthew, even when he writes the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25. So James is a unique book. Again, it's not very long. We're not going to go over an in-depth study of these, because we're just going to kind of look at these as we move along quickly. But I do want to say this. In 1522, Luther did make some harsh statements about the Epistle of James. These statements became notorious among scholars who have sometimes taken them out of context. The statements derive from Luther's frustration with opponents who used James chapter 2 as an attack to attack what Luther had learned about justification and sanctification while carefully studying the epistles of Paul. The chief problem is raised by the way James and Paul use the same terms, faith and law, and the same Old Testament history examples from Abraham's life to illustrate very different points about the Christian life. Critics have been delighted that Luther described James as an epistle of straw in 1522 and have used this statement as justification for launching attacks on other New Testament documents and doctrines. However, a patient consideration of Luther's statements yields the following important points. Luther's description of this book changes. In some cases, Luther describes James as the work of an apostle, but in other cases, he argues that it was not written by an apostle. When Luther describes James as straw, he is referring to its mundane moral topics and not its truthfulness. In medieval Wittenberg, straw was appreciated for its usefulness, but it was also characterized as having low value. So in his 1522 preference of the New Testament, Luther is making a contrast between James and the other New Testament epistles and is not dismissing James outright. So there's a whole lot we can talk about it, but let's move on. We've got a couple more we're going to look at really quick. We're going to pair these together, 1st and 2nd Peter. These are the letters that Peter writes. And this is, again, another pretty important element that we get in the New Testament, and we see some really unique themes that Peter calls to us. Both of these epistles are written between 67 and 68 AD, so about 15 to 18 years after James was written. We've got Peter being made the main focus. Jesus is the another main focus, and then Peter also essentially has two target audiences in this book. One is the false teachers and false preachers that he's writing against. But when he talks about Christians and their faith, he is asserting that this is for all believers. So one of the unique passages I think that we could really come to appreciate in this particular chapter, or is in chapter 3, starting in the 21st verse. I'm actually going to go back just a little bit to verse 20. It says, because they did not formally obey, and this again is continuation of a whole theme from earlier in chapter 3, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God in good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who's gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers, and being subjected to him. So this is a wonderful little verse. It's not out of place. It would be very hard to take it out of context. Peter's equating the floods of Noah to baptism. The floods of Noah saved those 8 people. Now baptism saves the Christian. And I'm going to dig into the concept of baptism deeper on my podcast. So those will come probably in a handful of weeks as I kind of am working through this series. So if you're interested in the Lutheran perspective of baptism and how that differs from the other denominations, tune in, and you would be, hopefully, you'll enjoy the content. So our next book we're going to look at, just really quick, is Jude. Very short book again. It's written about 68 AD, so about the same time as Peter's. This letter is strictly written against false teachers, and Jude goes on and he quotes a lot of Old Testament. It's a very, very short epistle. You can read it in about 5 minutes, but it's because it's really essentially made up of a greeting. We have a judgment on false teachers, verses 3 through 16. We have the call of perseverance from 17 to 23, and a closing doxology in the last 2 verses. So it's only 25 verses long, very short, but very powerful. So I encourage you to just spend some time reading these smaller epistles. They don't take very long, but there's a lot of wealth of knowledge in them. And if this was a really long Bible study, I would dig into it verse by verse. The last one we're going to look at is 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. These are written in the scope of 85 to 95 AD. John is writing a plethora of books and letters that engage some of the false teachings that have come out. And so one of the first heresies that came out of the 1st century and 2nd century church is Gnosticism. This was a belief of like a special revelation, and only certain people are granted that, and if you have this special revelation, then you will be saved. It obviously has been deemed heretical by the church, and John is writing as part of that. There are greater people that he does target in this, and so we see the brethren, which is just Christians, children, fathers, young men. Then he does turn to the Antichrist, the false teachers, but most of it is to warn the Christian communities of this teaching that is infiltrated. So the purpose of this letter really is to establish and encourage the faith of John's contemporaries in the wake of rising controversy because of some had left the Christian congregations or had troubled them. So we see that John, again, with kind of similar to what Paul does, writing to reassure those churches. And then we will look at, next week, look at Revelation and Hebrews. We'll probably do Hebrews first and then Revelation. So I'm going to conclude this little journey. Again, nowhere near exhaustive. There's so much more we can dig into these, but just for time's sake, I'm giving a very general breakdown. These are longer than what I originally want to do in 5 minutes, but we will make this kind of theme hopefully shortened down as we go through Hebrews and Revelation, and then we'll start looking at some of the early church functions and how that plays in. The goal of these videos, if you've made it this far, the goal of these videos is very simple. It's one, to provide basic help and education and understanding to the books of the New Testament, and 2, to demonstrate the kind of course that Christianity has taken through the last 2,000 years, and to then demonstrate from the Reformation, from the Lutheran perspective, why we do the things we do as Lutherans. Why do we have a liturgy? Why do we celebrate communion once a month? Why do we have baptism and acknowledge it as a sacrament. All of these things we will be covering in coming weeks. So I hope you enjoy this series. Stay tuned for more. I will be back Wednesday for a Bible devotion on the Psalms, and we will have our soup supper 6 p.m. along with a devotion on the book of Proverbs. So I hope to see you guys then. Have a great week, and God bless.